Marcy, so good to have you on the show.
Nate, it's so good to be here.
The forgotten adoption option is a tongue twister.
But you nailed it.
It took me a few tries.
But you practiced or something. It worked.
Yes, I did. Tell me, what is the forgotten adoption option?
Yeah, I accidentally started a nonprofit because I adopted siblings through foster care. And in trying to figure out what to call what I was doing, I was teaching families in my home. And then with a stimulus payment, I actually wrote those kind of trainings down into a book called The Forgotten Adoption Option. But at the time, it didn't have a name. I think if you go back in my early files, it was something like no cost adoption, which gets a little bit of negative feedback of like, Marcy, what does that mean? There's emotional cost, like financially. And I was like, okay. So one of my good friends on my board, she was adopted. She's in marketing. And we played with a lot of words and a lot of different ways and how to talk about this. And we came up with the forgotten adoption option because most people think of, oh, I know people that have adopted babies. Oh, I know people that have adopted overseas. Oh, and I also know people that are foster parents. But most people don't say, oh, I know people like you, Marcy, that intentionally pursued children who were legally available in the foster care system and you adopted them and you didn't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars. People don't know that you can just go through foster care and adopt kids that are available.
Legally available through the foster care system. That's a big statement because I didn't know that.
Well, we don't even have a word for it. Like we call them foster children, which we call any child in foster care a foster child, right? And child in foster care, however you want to word that, right? And so we get confused because we put them all into one big bucket. And then some say, oh, those are waiting children. And people are like, what are they waiting for? Well, they're waiting to be adopted, but it's just not like a common thing we understand in our society. And so when you look at the whole population, there's 113,000 children currently that are in foster care that are the ones that are waiting, that are legally available, that are waiting for a forever family, or they're waiting so long they're actually aging out of the system. Mm. And I have 2 of them, but there's still a whole lot left. And I'm trying to help find other people to become the families for these kids.
Wow. What are the age ranges of these kids?
So one thing I get is people say, well, you didn't tell me how to adopt a baby, Marcy. And I'm like, you're right. This is not infant adoption. And just the way that the process works, because there's legal stuff to all of this, a child under the age of 2 is very, very rarely ever adoptable because there's just process. So the majority are going to be ages 8 to 18. That's just how the numbers kind of sort out. I met my kids. Listen, my daughter was a week before she turned 3, and my son was about to turn, he was 4. So we adopted like 18 months later, but they're non-infants is the short version. We have a huge need for people to adopt teenagers, sibling groups, and kids with special needs. So whether that's a medical need or mental health need, those are kind of some of the challenges and opportunities that exist.
And so there was a movie out not too long ago, maybe it's a couple of years ago.
You're thinking Instant Family.
Instant Family.
Yeah, Shawn Anders did a great job.
Yeah, it was great. And I wonder how close to reality that movie, and maybe our listeners wondering too. So someone listening is thinking, wow, first, I haven't even thought about this. Perhaps I have.
Yeah.
The episode about adoption was interesting. For us, my wife and I, we had one child, and he was our miracle baby. He was 9 weeks early. He was 3 pounds 4 ounces. Then he shrunk.
A lot of time in the
NICU.
Yeah.
So, and back in those days, you couldn't sleep there overnight. So you had to leave your baby, and it was really very traumatic. And so then we thought, well, we wanted to have a bigger family, but we couldn't have any more kids, and the whole, that just didn't work out physically. So we thought, well, let's go through the adoption process. And it's a tough process.
Yeah.
And if anyone listening has gone through it,
like that alone.
Yeah. Just all the steps. And honestly, sometimes the adoption agencies might even try to talk you out of it in some ways, because I don't know why, but maybe it's a vetting system or whatnot, or I don't know.
Might be a little supply demand if you're going in the infant space. And the foster care space, the issue isn't they're trying to talk you out of it. They actually try to, instead of going straight to adoption, oh, we need foster families. And it's like, that's not what I want. And so same kind of concept here.
Yeah, indeed. For us, we were a little older, so we were closer to the age, I guess, aging out as adults for the programs that we were looking at. And
so they told you were older and you had a limit.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes, for adoption. Yeah, I think at the time it was 50 and I was maybe 45 or 46 or something like that. So it was getting close because it does take time. anyway, we did a lot of due diligence. We paid a fee. I think it was like $4,000 for someone to help us.
They do a home study kind of thing.
Yeah, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So we were invested, and of course, then life happened, and it kind of started. Well, is this something we really want to do? And then we're like, well, let's foster. Then we thought about fostering. Well, then we had a couple of nieces who just so happened to come into the foster system. So we thought, okay, let's foster them, which was totally cool. A lot of challenges, as you would expect. However, and of course, they ended up getting out of that system and life. They grew up. But it's very, like you said, it's very confusing. And there's so many unknowns, and there's so much emotion around it. It's unconsolidated. It's a tough environment. And here you step into it because you want to be a change maker.
Kind of accidentally, though.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I raised my hand and said, like, hey, you know what? This is really confusing. I want to go through a really confusing process. In fact, like, I mean, if I give you like a drive-by, Nate, of our process, we got licensed to adopt older kids. We wanted to adopt up to 2 because my husband did not want to have the big family I wanted. So I said, they'll come together then. We'll do it the way I want to do this. And as we walked it out, we interviewed for one sibling pair, and we were not picked. We'd never met the kids. You interview like you're marrying them, like not like that, but like you're making this lifelong commitment to raise them. We didn't get them, so we're stress eating that night. We get an email that same night about a different sibling pair, no pictures, which is super weird. There's no red flags. We apply anyway, and they call us one afternoon, which is not supposed to happen. They're supposed to like interview you, and there's process, and I get a call from an unknown number, but I was like, I think I know what this is. So I'm at work, and I answer my phone, and they're like, oh, we picked you. There were 10 families that applied. We just need to make sure you don't smoke because one of the kids has smoke-induced asthma. And they said, oh, it's about 4 months that's left in kind of the legal process, and you can kind of like work with the court and set your adoption date. And they don't tell you, 9 months in, if you could have like been a fly on the wall, I'm in my bathroom, my kids are in bed, and I'm on the floor in a pool of self-pity, kind of shaking my fist at like, why did I elect as adoption as my plan A? Like, I went after this because I had seen older kids overseas in an orphanage, and I heard about their trajectory. Like, they were likely to age out and go into prostitution or criminal activity. And I thought, well, then my solution to that is I'm going to go adopt children and prevent that from happening, right? But I didn't understand the emotional rigor and the rawness. But at the same time, I didn't understand that never was it ever really about me. Like, I just needed to be willing to go through hardship and to really experience some really difficult times because these kids are worth it and they needed that. My kids, we were their 7th placement, which is ridiculous because they were really, really young. And so my husband and I had to go back and forth. I'm like, okay, they keep changing what's going on. Are we still holding on? And we're like, we're holding on because they've never had stability. And if we have to drive the 5 hours across state a couple times a month, like, so be it. So they can feel stable and they can know that holidays happen every year. They didn't understand that. They didn't understand birthdays happen every year because there was no rhythm to their life. And so really what's interesting in this space is that I've learned that somehow, because when you've gone through something, when you teach other people that, even though it's yucky and messy and it doesn't sound very attractive on the outside to be like, oh my goodness, that was like a super emotional roller coaster with a lot of unpredictability. But when you let people know on the front end, and this used to happen in my living room well before the pandemic and I shifted to Zoom, every single family I taught, and I thought I overwhelmed them, they all went and did it and thought, well, I know what I'm signing up for and I feel equipped and I know what to do. So, okay, it might be like 54 steps, but, you know, I was like training for Mount Everest and you told me everything to pack. So let's do it.
Nice.
It's pretty interesting how that all kind of evolved.
Tell me about the range of emotions you had to experience during that process.
like the emotions where you're trying to figure out like which kids to apply for. And you get to read what someone else wrote down and you freak out because you're like, oh my gosh, that could become this or that. And I remember sitting with my husband like, okay, I don't know if we can apply for these kids because like, what if this kid does that or these behaviors? And my husband, his grandfather was orphaned when he was 7. So Grandpa Sam was 7. He was in St. Louis. He was on his own living on the streets. And so my husband has a huge heart for this. And he just sat me down one night and was like, hey, if we have biological kids, can you predict that they won't make these choices? Oh, okay. That's a fair argument, right? So it kind of got me out of that fear and lie. But then you also just have all this other stuff where you're dealing with children that have come out of abuse, neglect, loss, something traumatic, right? And there's emotions on how do you help them process that? In our situation, we weren't coming from one of infertility. It was we chose this, but you still have to figure out how am I objectively a parent and helping them understand their whole story, because that's something I have a lot of families I coach that is their drive. Like, this wasn't available for me, so I'd like to go this path, please. And then you have to really kind of let go of this dream and desire, because you're dealing with a kid that already has experience in life, and you can't deny it. I mean, you can try, but the best thing to do for the child is to kind of be a mentor to them and be a parent and all the things that help them therapeutically kind of process where they've been and be okay with it, and to know that adoption's beautiful and there's nothing wrong with them. Like, they are wanted. They were just kind of, unfortunately, in a hard scenario.
It gets me thinking about what kind of place you have to be in. Clearly, that's not everyone. Everyone's not in a place where they can be someone who can bear the burdens and mentor and help someone work through their deepest type of tragedies in life. What are some of the emotional and spiritual muscles needed to be able to carry that weight?
Yeah, and you hit step one, which is what I call the heart. That this has nothing to do with do I have enough money to pursue this? There's no financial question here, because the state helps you with health insurance and food, all these things. So like, that's not even in the scenario. It's really about, where am I at? If I'm in a relationship, are my significant other and I on the same page about doing this? And sometimes that comes with somebody saying, I had a poor relationship with my parent. I don't even think I can parent well. Or I don't know if I can love a child that's not my biological child well. And you really got to process and work through that. For me, I had some childhood trauma that I had never, ever processed. And I was like, okay, so I can either go into parenting and not address this and just pretend like it's okay, or I know the kids that we're going to help are going to need therapy. And so if I just kind of muster up somehow that muscle to go through the therapy and all of that heaviness, I can tell my kids openly how important it is to have therapists, how great it is, how I have one, how dad has one. And so some of that is just the maturity of mental health. I mean, a lot of this is the mental health space. A lot of it is being open to asking for help. I have several people that are further along in their adoptive family journeys, that I can message at the most random of times. And now I have those people in my life, and I'm that for them, where this weird thing happened. What do I say? What do I do? How do I do this? And it's just being willing to know that you have no idea what you're doing in any given moment, but you're trying, and you know that you can provide stability. And as my husband often says, love, Marcy, love. Love can help a child in so many ways. That's it. Just to love them through it.
Yeah, that's the key.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's that's simple. It's not easy always, but it's still simple. It's a simple philosophy, the philosophy of love. You said something that really got me thinking about the maturity and emotional maturity, and not only that. And you talked about therapy. If our listeners will know that we support therapy. It's ironic, and the fact that we applaud people when they go to the gym, but we give condolences when they go to the therapist. Like, really? I mean, it should be the same. It should be the same encouragement, right? Your mental, emotional health, spiritual health is just as important as your physical health. It's just a different domain. So you get that therapist membership, right?
Yeah.
And you're
on a wait list, because that kind of happens too sometimes.
Yeah. That's something that we should encourage and we should affirm, because we don't have enough of that. And the maturity, I don't think necessarily starts with the healing. The maturity starts with, boy, I'm ready to take steps so that I can be well. Because if I can be well, then I can help others be well. And that's the key, because if I'm in a state to where I'm totally, in a destructive state, well, then that's going to be destructive for those around me. I've got to start making changes. Do you find when you're coaching foster care parents who are considering going into the adoption side of the foster care, that you've got to have those conversations with people?
Oh, yeah. They're all over it. There was a presentation I gave to a university a few months back, and I one of the things that I really enjoy about the work I get to do is I get to have sometimes what are private conversations with people that you would never have publicly, right? And one of my favorite questions, and it was this group of women, and you could ask me anything. And the only thing I protect my children's story. So I don't just openly tell you like, this is the problems they're going through and their backstory. Cause I'm like, that's their story. They'll tell you if and when they're ready. And if they don't, you don't need to know that. Like you get to know the parenting side. But I had this woman in the group understanding the needs of these children. And she said, how can I know that I can help a child with mental health needs when I myself may have them? And I loved her question in a group of women to just openly talk about that. And I was able to encourage her to say, who better is qualified, right? Like who better than someone that's been there? And at the same time, to what you're saying, while there's this kind of stage where it's sort of like any new relationship, we're like, oh, this is so great. It's like romantic, right? Like, oh, it's great. I'm going to go to therapy. Like it's going to get better. But like what we don't talk about is how freaking hard it is to go to therapy. Like there were times I didn't want to go because I was like, I'm only going because they made an appointment, but I don't want to talk through this. Like there are reasons why I haven't talked to anyone about this in my entire lifetime, right? And there were times I would come home from that hour appointment and my husband and I, we have no kids at the time. And he's just like, okay, so, and I was like, tonight I just need to be in bed in the dark all by myself. Please don't talk to me. Please don't touch me. Like you have to go through that to heal. And that's the ugly side of it that I think sometimes we can know that it's good for us to do therapy, right? And I have many, many friends that are therapists and I very much value and appreciate what they bring to people and to me. But to work through our own isn't just a one-time thing either, right? Like maybe it's for a season you're working on this thing and unpacking it, but then as other things happen, it's bringing up other needs and other things. And so I think to what you're saying, it's very important and critical to work through our past, but at the same time, to do that requires a very conscious determination of like, okay, the goal at hand is that I know this is good for me and that I want to be a good role model. And that's really kind of what it boils down to.
Yeah. There's a lot of honesty and even humility that works in that whole philosophy. I found that even when you talk about leadership, I found that effective leaders at the highest levels, like we can consider icons of leadership, are able to connect with their past, even the tragic parts of their past, and utilize that for creating a better future state for them and those who they are charged to be a part of in their lives. And I think about Walt Disney as an example. I studied Walt Disney for my
with your dissertation
yes,
that you shared with me. Very well done.
Thank you. So Disney had lamented about his childhood. His dad had a paper route in Kansas City, and he talked about all these early mornings in the dark and cold and delivering these newspapers. And Walt was the kind of kid who was very creative, loved to draw, loved to play, as you would expect. So he considered it squelched out of his life. He lost his childhood. But he didn't consider... He wasn't upset with his dad. It was just the necessity of the family. What he did was he took that and he magnified it into something that he could turn into good through the trials and the traumas that he faced. In other words, he wanted to be able to offer that childlikeness, that childhood experience, that creative, inventive experience for people all over the world. And initially he did that through cartooning. Then he did that through film. Of course, then he did that through his parks, where he created a 3D, if you will, experience where people were immersed in the environment. And interestingly, even in the park, when he first did Magic Kingdom, he wanted to create this huge wall around it so that you could not see Anaheim around you, because he wanted you to feel as though you were totally immersed in a world that embraced your deepest desire to let go of all your trouble.
Because that's what you do in childhood. Like you're playing and you're not, you don't pay attention to the big picture.
Yeah. So I think it's important to understand your past, and perhaps even as we take steps forward to allow it to magnify a better future for those who we are entrusted to serve alongside of and to serve, especially the children. I say that to my son. My dad wasn't around. My parents got divorced when I was young, and my dad, I only saw him once a year. And I would tell my son, man, I want to make sure that I can spend as much time with you and tell you the things that are important to tell you. It wasn't until my dad died when I was at his funeral And his friends all came up to me and said, "Man, your dad was so proud of you. Dad was so proud of you. He always talked about
And
you."
you were surprised.
I was surprised. I'm like, wow, he
Uh-huh.
never told me that. Not that I was upset. And we had a good relationship. I mean, he died when I was 31, or 30. And so we had a relationship, but I didn't know those things. And my son was born 2 years later, and I wanted to make sure that he knew that I was proud of him no matter what he did. It was just give the effort that you know you can give to be the best version of yourself you can be. In other words, if you're, and he's only 16, but if your goal and your giftings create a model for you to be a CEO of a company, then just do it with all your heart. If it's to be the best janitorial clerk, be that with the best image of your abilities. I will be proud of you no matter what. And I say that to say, again, my dad just didn't understand the value of it. And there's certain things that I'm going to miss as a parent. That's what I tell my son. Like, look, man, I'm not going to get it all right. And so this is just an opportunity for you where we might miss it as father and son, for you to take that and then use it for good for the next generation and continue to grow from it emotionally, spiritually, mentally. There's power. There's power in our past. And I know we didn't even, this was not part of the conversation, but I think that's an important piece because, especially in the fostering system, and we fostered 2 nieces, and they had a difficult past, and we were able to share in some of that struggle. It was different, but they were not alone.
Right.
And I think that transparency and that vulnerability that you can have, not necessarily as a foster parent, but just another human being that sees you and understands that you are important.
Right. And it's not private per se, or it's not a secret. Because if you kind of go back to your what you were talking about how do you kind of build the next generation, a common thread that's really interesting to me in this space is when children are in the system young enough, or because oftentimes their children often get adopted by either family, like what you mentioned, kin, or by a foster parent or someone like me that's not related to none of those people. And so what's interesting is sometimes kids are young enough that these kids have been with these families like their lives. And so there's been a shift, but it still exists, where we used to not tell kids they were adopted, right? Like it used to kind of be the secret. You didn't want to tell them. And we even still today, my kids have been at school where kids are joking like, "Oh, you're adopted." And it's like, that's still actually not funny.
Right.
Don't know why that popped up, or they'll even say to my kids like, "Well, you're not adopted. You look like your parents." And it's like, they're being honest. That's okay. But what's interesting is that the people that have come to me that say, "Marcy, I have this young girl. I've had her. She's like 6 years old. Her brother lives down the street. It's normal to her that her brother lives down the street with this other person, and they know their brother and sister. My daughter doesn't know she's adopted." And to me, I'm very direct and want to help people grow and through that. And so I've had the opportunity to walk with these parents to say, we need to stop right now and we need to role play. And you need to like in the next week, I don't care when or how or what, you've got to tell your kid, because you've got to think if that was you, right? Like I have a sister that has a different father than me. Actually, I have 2 sisters that do with different dads. But one of them in particular, my parents didn't tell her that she had a different dad until high school. And I saw it do really sad, unnecessary harm to her. And I think that's why I care so much about this space. And so I've had this beautiful opportunity to help parents, like, let's role play. I'm going to be the parent, you be the kid. And well, Marcy, the story, it's not a good story. Like, I just don't think I should tell them their story. Well, then tell the story in an age appropriate way and tell it the way you'd want to hear it, right? Like, it's so special that you came to us. There were some things that were dangerous for you and we were able to help. And as the kid get older, tell a little bit more and explain that. But like, you don't have to like hide the story. Because to me, there's so much that a child gets to do and know when they're aware of their beginnings, right? And I think that can be hard for some people. I mentioned earlier, when infertility is the motive for adoption, that becomes a really hard pain point where you can want to shield and hide that because you want to be like, I'm the only thing this kid has ever known. it's fine. Like
Yeah.
it's good. But the reality is when you're adopting, especially through foster care and even the adoption space in general, for a child to have whole identity, they need to know where they came from. And it needs to be okay to talk about that. My kids know that it's completely okay to ask questions about their bio family. They're both in middle school now. So we've gone through these like interesting phases where like a devotional book, well-intended, has little exercises of like, look at your toes. Is this one longer? How about your fingers and your hair? Whose fingers and hair do you have? And they come down to breakfast and I'm like, I don't know. That wasn't something I paid attention to. I know some other things about you, but I don't know that. Sorry. But it's just an open dialogue, or they can ask for pictures and we have a collection. Like there's different things that are very, very open that I think are helping, I'm hoping, are helping my kids really unpack their story in a way that helps them realize who they are. And if they want to share that, great. And if they don't, that's fine. But at home, it's completely transparent.
Yeah. No, that's so good. Steve Jobs was adopted.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so he called his adoptive parents his parents, his mom and dad. And he knew he eventually was able to find his parents. He never actually never with his biological father, he never had a relationship with. Interestingly, it just come to me, Walt Disney's first child was adopted as well. And of course, my dissertation was on Milton Hershey, Walt Disney, Steve Jobs. And Milton Hershey adopted many kids because he had his home for children, which he gave his entire fortune to. Just a fascinating, all these different people who have interacted with the adoption experience, right? And even the foster caring experience. So someone listening is like, I don't know if I have what it takes. I'm interested. I know that there's a possibility. What do you say to that person?
Yeah.
What are there criteria? Is there a checklist?
I don't know if there's a checklist. I tend to be like, well, okay. For me, I thought about it for a long time. And then I tried to figure out how to do it. And it took me 5 years to figure out the how. And so if people are like, I'm kind of thinking, I'm not sure, I point them. I have a lot of free resources. I have an app. It's at forgottenadoptionoption.app. You can browse through it. It goes over questions to ask your heart, things that your home should be prepared for. And it just kind of gives you like if you do want to do this, this is what you're going to have to do, just so you know. I also have a book called The Forgotten Adoption Option that it's based on, I used to coach families in my home pre-pandemic that were like friends of friends, and they knew I had blogged my adoption journey since it went from 9 months to 18, and I needed something to do with that energy of my self-pity in the bathroom. And so people started contacting me, how'd you do it? How'd you do it? And so I wrote the how down. You can Google how to adopt through foster care. I have not found it to be written like someone went through that process. It feels very clinical. And so it is bumpy and it's not a straight line. And so I think sometimes what turns people off is there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of open-handedness meaning like you might get into this and think, Marcy, so I browsed online, I saw the kids on the Heart Gallery, and I'm like absolutely certain this like sibling group of 3, they're mine. And you go and you apply for those kids, but then you find out that one, there's someone else already in the queue. They're not available. And then you kind of are like, well, not going to do it because I was like totally in love with that idea. And it's like, okay, let's back up. First, thank you for browsing online. It's so good and healthy to give these kids attention and to be aware of them. You're not going to see all of them because some kids will get ridiculed at school and by their peers for being listed online, right? So please go browse. Please be aware. Please be open when you browse that child or sibling group is to inspire you, but the likelihood of you adopting that particular child is not there. So if you're kind of comparing this to, well, I went online and I wanted to adopt this dog and it was fine. We're not in the same arena at all. Like this is so different. But number 2, I think if you can just be ready to do what's needed to help a child, you're ready for this. And that might look bumpy. I often tell people that like, when you go to the grocery store, and, if Nate, you and I are shopping at the same time, you went in the other lane and you got in and out before I did. And I'm like, I picked the wrong cashier. And like, you're so frustrated by that. And what happens in the foster care space is that you might feel like you totally got the bad cashier because it's slow and you want to get out of line and maybe your paperwork gets lost. All these things happen. I have a new book coming out in November called What to Know When You Adopt Through Foster Care, intentionally with this intent, because a lot of times what happens is people hit these bumps or these pieces of red tape or things totally change directions. They're not ready for it. And it's really frustrating. It's like, well, this is actually kind of normal, unfortunately. But if you can just know how to muster it and how to emotionally balance yourself, if you just stay focused that you're helping a child or sibling group, it's going to be okay. And at the end of that cashier, not that we're doing a transaction, but you'll be helping a child. Unfortunately, that child has no influence on you and how they're marketed to you and your customer experience, unfortunately. And I'm trying to work on that. But if you can just kind of get your heart in the right spot. Why am I doing this and for who? And then run with that, I think you're ready. And if you want something lighter, you can do something called respite, which is where you do like overnight care for 1 to 14 nights in a row. You typically kind of give a family, like a foster family, a little bit of a break for a few days. It's a great way to get your feet wet. If you don't want kids living with you, you can also become a court-appointed special advocate. It's called the CASA. You can go online and figure all that stuff out. But you basically get to help within the court system to advocate for kids in the foster care system.
This is great. So someone listening is wondering the question I'm going to ask you. It might sound not so great, but people might be asking, okay, well, if I got the wrong cashier, even if I got the wrong cashier and I checked out, what's the return policy? Do I have 30 days? Do I have 60 days? Do I have 90 days? Or is it all sales are final? Somebody is probably wondering.
Yeah, that's a fair question.
What's the recourse if it's like, oh my goodness, I totally messed up. I made the completely wrong move.
Yeah. Super great question. I have never been asked that one. And I love that you're like, let's just do it. So let's do it. So, okay. Every state's a little smidge different, but in general, once a child, so like you go through all the licensing process, you get to meet this child or sibling group, and then they move in with you. So the move in with you starts a timer, and states differ between like 3 to 6 months. They have to live with you for a minimum of 3 to 6 months before you can go to court to like finalize that adoption. They're legally your family, right? So you have time within that 3 to 6 months to kind of be like, this isn't working. That happens. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And you do have that ability to be like, this is not the right fit for me. That happens. In my new book, there's actually even a story where a family finalized their adoption. The chapter's called We Didn't Gel. And it disrupted their entire family dynamic. And they did, I don't know what the actual terminology is, but they did disrupt the placement. So the child actually went back into the foster care system. So legally, that's there. But I think on the other side of it, there's other ways to work through compatibility. There's other ways to work through, like, what training have you gone through? What resources, like, how much do you know about children that have been through trauma? And my husband and I did some even advanced training because we were getting kids that were going to be older. And so we went through things like, for instance, there's a kind of a theory here or a metaphor called the invisible suitcase, that when a child moves in with you, they bring their belongings, but they also bring this invisible suitcase. You can't see it, but there's all sorts of stuff in it that they kind of unpack over time. And just even having that frame of reference of, okay, there's some things that our kids are doing behavior-wise and we don't understand why. And they probably don't even have words for it, because how many kids have the emotional maturity to be able to talk through that? But just being aware of some of like what trauma does to the brain and those kinds of things can really help you be a stronger parent and be more prepared. Having mentors in this space can happen too. So the short of the long answer is there are ways to pull out at any point. You're not like completely bound to the process, but there's also ways on the front end to be pretty proactive to be able to get some help. But there are situations too, there are families that I coach as well, that as their kids have aged, the children have needed more severe help, right? So sometimes kids end up moving into group home situations, even though they're adopted, because of the severity of the issues and the behaviors they're going through. And that tends to be a better environment for them.
Yeah. So there's different, like you said, there's different options.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder to what extent sometimes folks, and this is, I'm sure it's completely subjective based on the situation, you know, in a business or when you're exercising and that first period is difficult. And there's a lot of acclamation. Of course, in business, we always say, just keep trying, right? Just keep swimming. And I wonder how much of that same philosophy applies in this environment. Again, it's probably, they're situational, right?
Yeah. I mean, year one, we know has different things to it. So like, for instance, like some things that I can tell people is one, we know that children who are adopted, no matter what age they were adopted, around like middle school, like 12, 13, they're going to have an identity crisis, and they might go completely one direction and have a lot of emotion and negativity and explore a lot of things simply because they feel unwanted, right? Like that's so we've kind of been anticipating that for our own kids, just because we're like, that's just what happens. Not that it's like, okay, but if we know that it's coming, like let's prepare for the storm ahead, right? That's very normal. We also were given advice as we were finalizing our adoption. Our kids have been living with us for 18 months, so a year and a half at that point. And there was a family that warned us. They had taken their kids. They wanted to finalize their adoption for the holidays. They wanted to take the big family cruise for Christmas. They finalized at Thanksgiving. They go on this cruise at Christmas, and it like completely messed with these kids because they had a very lavish Christmas, and then they came back home and it was a new environment yet again. And so all these behaviors just spiraled. And so the advice we were given was, if at all possible, don't go on a vacation for a year. Like, just let the kids gel into where they are and settle, and then help them learn that new experience. So we actually we had a vacation planned up to Wisconsin in this cute lake property. And I actually wrote the property owner, and was like, hey, we're actually finalizing our adoption in a few weeks. Can we book for next year? Like, and this is why. And they were so enthusiastic and excited for us, which was a beautiful thing. And they were like, of course you can. That's great. I totally understand. But that was something we chose because we'd heard, okay, by the way, you could kind of eliminate this disruption for your kids if you can just pause.
It's so good. Yeah. It just reminds me of when we were fostering, we went on a vacation, and we take some pretty like extravagant vacations after tax season. Our listeners would know I own an accounting and advisory firm.
You're ready for vacation at that point.
Oh man. Yeah. May. Oof. So it's a good couple of weeks, and we have fun. And when we got back, it was a total train wreck. Like it was just like, and we didn't understand why. We're like, wow, we just had this wonderful vacation, but it kind of makes sense now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was a disruption to the sort of the acclimation of, hey, this is my new environment. And then there's this, as much as it was cool, it was just a really weird type of experience. Yeah.
Yeah. When your background is what it is, you just don't have context. Because I'm sure for you, you're like, well, I didn't understand why we came back to that. And now you're like, oh, okay. And it's just, I don't think I would know if I was the child in that scenario to be like, hey, can I not go? Like, I just don't want to go on vacation because I understand I'm going to be a hot mess when I get back,
100%. And that's where mentorship and coaching and folks like you in your books, you've got, can I take a look here?
Yeah,
we got
absolutely.
The Forgotten Adoption option, which is amazing. A self-reflection and how-to guide for pursuing foster care adoption, gold. And this is the new one coming out, you said in November?
Well, this one, the one you just held is an ebook, audiobook, and paperback. So this is going to take you through the process as an adult. And now you're holding my children's book, came out last year in May, which is
great.
National Foster Care Month. It's called For You, a Forever Family. And it actually corresponds. I just worked with some local Girl Scouts, and we have a lesson plan that's going national this year. It aligns with diversity, equity, and inclusion to help kids celebrate being adopted. I got to go locally in schools. We had multiple school districts this year for our pilot group. I got to be in a kindergarten classroom, Nate, and read the story. And we did a small lesson. We do coloring pages and have a discussion about what foster care adoption is, because you just, the beginning of this conversation, like, what in the world is this anyway? It's kind of confusing, and we can teach it. We can teach the kids. I had the cutest lesson in this small group of like 20 kindergartners. We're reading through the book. The teacher's kicking off a lesson. She helped me co-write the lesson. And this little girl shoots her hand. Teacher, yeah, I was adopted. Oh, cool. This little boy looks at this little girl and goes, well, why? And the teacher swoops up the conversation. We're going to learn about why kids are adopted. Little girl raises her hand. Yeah. Can I share? Sure. She talks about how in the country she was from, there were too many kids, and her mom here wanted to have a child. And the book highlights all these different demographics. There's a grandma in the book. There's couples in the book. There's same-sex couples in the book. There's a single parent in the book. And so it's anyone can adopt. And so to me, it was just the sweetest thing for her at school to feel so bold and proud to say, this is something that's special about me. And I even know my story, and I'm happy to share it. And it's like, how many seeds got planted that day, right? All of a sudden, you have all these little kids. You had a couple that are like, I'm going to adopt when I get older. You have a teachers teaching the lesson who are thinking to themselves, I wonder if I could help. And you have the kids going home talking to their families about their kids in our community that need a family. Could we be that family? So it's been amazing to see how that's grown and flourished. And then there is a book coming out in November. November is National Adoption Month. And that book is called What to Know When You Adopt Through Foster Care, Real Life Stories and Practical Tips. So it's 61 chapters. It's got like 45 stories. We cover as much as we could. There's not everything. And you're probably going to want to read it in doses because the different people that have helped with my editing team, there's just a lot of emotionally heavy content in it. We cover mental health, cover sexual abuse, we cover siblings, we cover my paperwork got lost. Like the whole gamut is in there, and it's real. But if you know, like, these are real things that could happen and this is how to handle it, I really think you're more equipped to either know, okay, I'm opting out, this is not for me, or to go, this is absolutely for me. And now I know how to do it and I'm more confident, and let's go help kids.
And that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's super cool. You are so important. Your work is important. Thankful for you.
Oh, that's very kind. I just am a voice. I'm just trying to speak up. These kids legally cannot create their own materials, right?
Yeah.
Like they legally can't go on social and be like, "Hey, I'm 12 and I just wanted to let you know." You know, we see some of them on TV and we see some in social feeds and things like that, but they really don't have control over where they end up. And so if I can speak up and help one more kid like mine and help them have the opportunity to grow up in a family, because we know that kids do best growing up in families. We know when they age out of the foster care system, this whole domino happens, right? Homelessness, criminal activity. The likelihood of getting a college degree is like really, 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 really small. But if we can just help kids have a family while they're growing up and then help those families have the skills they need to work through the behaviors and help the children unpack their traumas, we have a whole different future and a whole other generation that's coming up after us that's in a whole different position.
Well, we will help you be their voice and magnify it.
I like that.
Thanks for being on the show.
This was fun.